Hi there, everyone. It's 4 o'clock in New York. The warnings were blinking red. That's how the Washington Post, in a mammoth new investigation into the January 6th insurrection, describes the scope of the intelligence about violent threats to the U.S. Capitol on the day the election was to be certified. A threat level described as unprecedented, though the warnings went ignored. The massive new reporting by the Washington Post, likely to go down in history as one of the definitive records of the attack, is based on interviews with more than 230 people and thousands of pages of court documents and internal law enforcement reports, along with hundreds of videos, photographs, and audio recordings. It is bursting with brand new information that could inform the congressional investigation into Donald Trump's role in the insurrection. We'll take you through all of it, starting with this alarming realization from Mark Sina, commander of the Intelligence Office for Homeland Security in Northern California. From the new reporting, quote, in the 20 years since the country had created fusion centers in response to the attacks of 9/11, Sina can remember a moment like this. For the first time, from coast to coast, the centers were blinking red. The hour, date, and location of concern was the same. 1 p.m., the U.S. Capitol, January 6th. The Post goes into detail about the nature of and the specificity of many of the threats posted openly online for everyone to see in the days, weeks, and months before the mob of Donald Trump's supporters descended on the U.S. Capitol. Quote, please be in D.C. armed on January 6th. Read an online post highlighted in an FBI memo shared with Capitol Police and local law enforcement. Quote, you might have to kill the palace guards. You okay with that? Read one comment. Another said, quote, drop a handful, the rest will flee. Another warning that the Post calls one of the most striking flares, quote, Trump supporters were discussing online how to sneak guns into Washington to, quote, overrun police and arrest members of Congress in January. It's according to internal bureau documents obtained by the Washington Post. The tipster offered specifics. Those planning violence believed they had, quote, orders from the president. Orders from the president. They used code words such as pickaxe to describe guns and posted the times and locations of 4 spots around the country for caravans to meet the day before the joint session. On one site, a poster specifically mentions Senator Mitt Romney as a target. The new reporting makes clear what intelligence officials and members of Congress have been saying for months now. January 6th was no intelligence failure, but a failure to respond to the abundant intelligence available. Perhaps most alarming, potentially among the most significant findings of the Washington Post investigation, is when it comes to assigning who bears responsibility for mobilizing, emboldening the mob. Was this on Donald Trump's 187 minutes of inaction as the Capitol was swarmed and seized by his supporters attacking in his name? Quote, during the 187 minutes that Trump stood by, harrowing scenes of violence played out in and around the Capitol. 25 minutes into Trump's silence, a news photographer was dragged down a flight of stairs and thrown over a wall. 52 minutes into Trump's silence, a police officer was kicked in the chest and surrounded by a mob. Within the first hour, 2 rioters died as a result of cardiac events. 64 minutes in, a rioter paraded a Confederate battle flag through the Capitol. 73 minutes in, another police officer was sprayed in the face with chemicals. 78 minutes in, yet another police officer was assaulted with a flagpole. 93 minutes in, another news photographer was surrounded, pushed down, and robbed of his camera. 94 minutes in, a rioter was shot and killed. And on and on and on, played out on live TV as Donald Trump, then the President of the United States of America, then the Commander-in-Chief, from whom the mob believed they were receiving their marching orders, watched, looked on, stayed silent. That is where we start today with some of our favorite reporters and friends. Carol Leonnig is here, Washington Post national reporter, co-author of the best-selling book, I Alone Can Fix It. She worked on this reporting. Also, former Assistant Director for Counterintelligence at the FBI, Frank Figliuzzi, is here. And Jason Johnson joins us, journalism and politics professor at Morgan State University and a contributor to the GRIO. All three MSNBC analysts. Carol Leonnig, first of all, this is such a feat. This is such a service. First, how did this come to be? And I didn't know this was coming. It was a surprise when I saw it sort of start to seep out over the weekend. But just talk about the effort.
You know, Nicole, thanks for proving that we were able to keep this a secret for a while, which is a reporter dream, right? You work on this forever and you finally break it, you scoop it. But also we do view this as a pretty intensive effort in public service. It came to be because an editor that I worked for named Matea Gold believed that there was just a flurry of questions that were never going to be answered. At the time that we began this and launched on this multi-person project, 75 reporters strong, Congress had decided essentially that they weren't going to investigate January 6th. Republicans were balking. Republican leadership was saying that they refused to give any subpoena power or agree to sign off on this investigation. And our editors all agreed that we should launch, and all the reporters, I remember getting the call, would you be willing to work on this? I remember being elated at the idea that we were going to spend this kind of energy and time digging into what happened before, during, and after. And that was a great idea of our national editor, Stephen Ginsburg, to break this into three parts. I mostly focused on the before, which we found so shocking because, remember, we think we're good reporters. We think we report a lot of good information in real time or close to the time. We unveiled a lot of things in January about what happened before that terrible storming of the Capitol and our icon of democracy. But what we learned was so much worse, Nicole. It was essentially that there were a ton of warnings in plain sight telling everybody exactly what these protesters plan to do. I mean, down to bring secure communications, because when this attack, which is likely to unfold, we're going to need to have a secure way to communicate and not get caught. Down to bring your weapons and break them down into these pieces so DC police can't stop you at the borders and you will be able to get our weapons inside. Down to the chilling part that you just read, which I remember when we found it, on December 17th, the FBI gets a tipster call who warns them there's chatter on this extremist site that's pro-Donald Trump, and they are saying, let's kill these cops around Congress on January 6th. Come armed. These people are, quote unquote, chicken blank. We will drop a few of the palace guards and the rest will flee.
Frank, what is the normal reaction from the FBI when a plan to kill cops is unearthed on websites?
Yeah, first, kudos to the Post for what is a shining example of what solid investigative journalism is and what it can do for a society. A couple of thoughts. There's a lot to unpack here. First, and I'm going to get on my soapbox here about the lack of domestic terrorism law in this country. There is a blindness that has almost become a willful blindness in federal law enforcement when it comes to seeing us as the threat, seeing ourselves as the threat, seeing white folks, Americans that align with the president in power as a threat. What we keep hearing, even from FBI Director Christopher Wray in testimony, is a couple of things. First, he keeps repeating the mantra, which is absolutely true, that the FBI doesn't investigate ideology, it investigates violence. Well, the second thing we keep hearing from the FBI and federal law enforcement is it's so hard, so difficult to distinguish between the aspirational and those who are truly planning to execute. But here's what this report does for those two statements. It causes those two statements to really seem weak. Here's why. Plans to kill cops, repeated discussions about how to do it, how to breach security, how to travel there, what we might have to do or not. That's not aspirational anymore. There's too many people saying it with too much specificity. Secondly, with regard to the very valid concern that we never want an FBI who violates constitutional right to free speech and to assembly and to free thought, again, we see in this report that we're way beyond that here. The local fusion centers, we're seeing it, we're raising the flags, right? And yet, as it goes up the chain, if it even went all the way to FBI headquarters, it was seemingly being discounted, ignored. This is why we need the January 6th Select Committee, to look at exactly what's happened here so that it doesn't happen again. And when people like Condoleezza Rice say America wants to move on, I say we didn't move on after 9/11. We investigated the root causes and we fixed them. We created a Department of Homeland Security. We put CIA and FBI under one roof in a counterterrorism center in Northern Virginia. We can't move on from this until we figure out why it happened and how we prevent it from happening again.
I mean, Frank, there's so much to unpack from your effort to unpack this. We still take off our freaking shoes because the shoe bomber, it was one of the plots declassified. I mean, this is sort of the other end of that approach. And I want to understand, I want to put the picture back up of the insurrection as it played out. What the minutes of Donald Trump's inaction, I think, beg us to probe more is why didn't anybody do anything for the hours that looked more like a tailgate than a crime scene?
Yeah, and for those on the Trump defense team who are fighting the Select Committee's efforts to get their hands on his communications and what happened that day and leading up to that day, here's the issue, right? If you claim there's no legislative purpose, no legitimate investigative purpose here, we've got 3 hours of inaction. And what happened in that Oval Office? How many calls did he get telling him, sir, you need to stop these people. It's out of control. You can't do this. How many before January 6th when they said even your rally speech is going to be problematic? You know, we need to know that it gets to his mindset and actually gets to the possibility of criminal intent here. That's why this is so important.
I'm going to read from the Washington Post reporting about Donald Trump in 1 second, but I need to bring you in, Jason, on this. What the Post unearths are 2 draft tweets from Jason Miller. Jason Miller wanted Trump to send this, quote, bad apples like Antifa or other crazed leftists infiltrated today's peaceful protest over the fraudulent vote count. Violence is never acceptable. MAGA supporters embrace our police and the rule of law and should leave the Capitol now. Jason Miller also drafted this tweet for Trump to send. The fake news media who encouraged this summer's violent and radical riots are now trying to blame peaceful and innocent MAGA supporters for violent actions. This isn't who we are. Our people should head home, let the criminals suffer the consequences. Jason, I mean, there's so much. You know, one, this is exactly who they are. This is exactly who they want to be. This is exactly who they're still defending. What do you make of these tweets?
So, one, I'm going to join in the chorus. This is fantastic reporting. And then I'm going to say something else, which is, it is disturbing to me as an American citizen. It's disturbing to me as somebody who was there in D.C. on the day that this happened, who was used to being able to go to that part of town. It's disturbing to me that some of the most damning and searing and important information that we're finding out about that attack isn't coming from Congress. It's coming from Rolling Stone and the Washington Post. And that concerns me because it speaks to what Frank is talking about. There seems to be, I'm not saying that the FBI isn't working. I'm not saying that the administration doesn't care. But it seems that the alarm bells about this are not coming from our government. It seems like, you know, this administration has the fierce urgency of next week, right, when it comes to these sorts of things. I mean, they say they're looking into it. They say they're talking about it. But we're not hearing how dangerous this is from the people who are supposed to protect us. So that's the first thing, Nicole, that strikes me about this. But the other thing is this. What it speaks to is not just how vast these organizations are, but think about any party. Think about a bachelor party weekend or wedding or something else like that. Only about 20% of the people who sign up for the wedding actually show, right? All sorts of other people disappear. So we have a network of individuals who may have just not been able to get a Southwest flight that week. We have a vast network of people who helped the individuals who did attack our Capitol who are still out there. That is what struck me about reading this report, that the network of individuals who are still working at CVS, who are still working at construction sites, who are still working in law firms, they are sitting there plotting and planning, knowing that, oh my gosh, I didn't go to this trip, but the next trip to the Capitol, I'm going to be more prepared.
Carol, and I would say, I mean, the person who went to the Hill, I think more often than anybody else after 9/11 was Robert Mueller, and maybe right after him was George Tenet. So Jason makes a really interesting point. Democrats control, obviously, the administration, but the House and the Senate, and it is alarming when you read what you as journalists were able to put together. And none of this has really been presented in just oversight committees. I mean, where is the oversight testimony that establishes some of what you established in this piece?
You know, I'm trying to be hopeful that the committee will be able well, I mean, they have a little bit more power than we do in one respect. They have subpoena power, which we don't. And there are still, honestly, I mean, it kills me to say it, there are still unanswered questions, even after all of these reports work, after all the tireless effort. And I would say, Jason, I appreciate exactly what you're pointing out, but I think it's fair to deduce now, after all of this work, that the system is not working. And Nicole, you are, a hardened veteran of this moment, and Frank, you too, in the sense of post 9/11, we have an enormous architecture, a huge architecture that is supposed to get left bang, right? Left of bang is code for we're going to disrupt things before they happen. Here were a million opportunities to get left of bang, and our apparatus failed. And that could have been willing, that could have been intentional, that could have been fear, that could have been seeing white instead of black and brown. You know, we don't know every element of this, but we know it's a failure because, as Frank and you too, actually, Josh, point out, this aspirational element, it wasn't aspirational. Everything they said they were going to do, they did.
Right. I mean, Carol, I want to read from the reporting about Donald Trump's role, because I think we all cover this, will they or won't they subpoena Donald Trump? I mean, what you were able to report on is certainly a roadmap should they head down that path. Trump watched the attack play out on television and resisted acting, neither to coordinate a federal response nor to instruct his supporters to disperse. He all but abdicated his responsibilities as commander-in-chief. President reduced to mere bystander. His Make America Great Again army was on the march, just as he had commanded at the rally. The president had directed his followers to head to the Capitol in a forceful show of, quote, pride and boldness to pressure lawmakers to overturn the results of an election he falsely claimed had been rigged. And there they were, literally fighting to keep Trump in power. You give us what's happening at the other end of Pennsylvania Avenue, too, Carol. Pelosi and Schumer called Rosen from their secure location to ask him urgently to send reinforcements to the Capitol. Call the president, Schumer yelled at Rosen. Tell him to call off his people. Tell him to tweet that they have to stop this. Rosen, who a few days earlier barely survived an attempt by Trump to fire him and replace him with a loyalist willing to echo the president's wild claims about voter fraud, considered Schumer's suggestion impractical. What? Rosen spoke to senior White House officials that day, including Cipollone, but never to the president. So this is so encapsulates the whole problem. Everyone with a scrap of honor in them was scared bleepless of getting fired and replaced by a real coup planner, plotter, carry-outer, that they didn't do anything. That Rosen didn't call Trump after Schumer called him is one of, to me, the most stunning revelations, Carol.
You know, I'm glad you hammer in on that one, Nicole, because it is echoed over and over again, right? Rosen thought it was impractical, which really means he thought that calling was going to get nothing done. He was going to get roared at and achieve nothing. There's a reason why Chris Wray the FBI director, seemed to have his head down during a lot of this experience. Nobody was willing to tell the emperor, well, I take that back. Nobody believed that telling the emperor, you've got to stop this, was going to have a really solid chance of success. Meanwhile, at the White House, people who were very close to the president were begging Mark Meadows, get the president to stop this. People were begging Ivanka Trump, get your father to stop this. And those were impractical. They were not also successful.
I want to read for you, Frank, a little bit more of what the reporting fleshes out about the disconnect between the intelligence and law enforcement response. Capitol Police Director of Intelligence Jack Donahue and DHS Division Chief Julie Farman made a grim prediction in their final internal report. January 6th would be far more dangerous to the Capitol and its occupants than the pro-Trump rallies in November and December. Quote, Congress itself is the target, they concluded. But the key analysis was tucked at the bottom of page 13 of a 15-page report. How is that possible, Frank?
There are so many unanswered questions here. One thing that jumped out at me related to this is the Washington, D.C. Intelligence Fusion Center actually suggested to area hospitals that they stock up their blood banks for
a mass casualty
January 6th.
event. Yeah.
That is a screaming, for a possible mass casualty event. So the disconnect there up to the feds, DHS, FBI headquarters, et cetera, has got to be parsed out and examined. And whether there are needed changes to domestic operating guidelines, I can tell you in my experience in the FBI, we spent much more time training and learning and being tested on throughout our careers the things we could not do domestically, because God forbid we violated constitutional rights, and we don't want an FBI that does that, but we never trained enough on, hey, here are the scenarios that will allow you to open an assessment, a threat assessment, a preliminary inquiry, and take a look. So the huge irony that we could be looking at here in part is that in an effort to not violate anybody's constitutional rights, we actually permitted an insurrection that would have taken down our democracy, the peaceful transfer of power. That needs to get fixed. That's why there is value in the Select Committee, because we've got to fix it just like we did after 9/11.
You know, Jason, I want to come back to your earlier point. The fact that it all rests on a select committee that is valiant in its ambition, but endangered. I mean, its members, its Republican members are literally being run out of the body in which they serve, on the committee in which they serve. Adam Kinzinger said over the weekend he thinks the committee will be killed if Republicans should prevail in the midterms. And I want to come back to what you're getting at. I mean, why is it all the work of the 1-6 committee, this committee that shouldn't even have had to be if a commission had been established by Congress?
So, yeah, Nicole, you're exactly right. This shouldn't all be on the 1-6 commission. It should also be on the Department of Justice. Why isn't Merrick Garland screaming about this every single day? Why isn't the president screaming about this every single day, at least from a symbolic standpoint? Nicole, I can tell you, before we even get to the specifics of this, this is also, believe it or not, in a larger macro-political sense, this is also why Biden's numbers are where they are. Those people who voted for him, those Americans who actually believe in this country, believe in democracy, including people who didn't vote for Biden but are certainly not insurrectionist terrorists, they feel like they got punched in the face on January 6th. They saw the whole country get attacked. And they want a president who's going to fight back. They want a president who talks about these terrorists the same way that we heard George Bush and Bill Clinton talk about terrorism for 20 years. They want to hear that about these people. It seems like they're being treated with kid gloves. And a lone committee that has limited power, that's hamstrung by basically a whole bunch of Benedict Arnolds on the Republican Party, is not going to be enough to keep us safe. There is nothing right now, other than perhaps the lone efforts of a couple of Capitol Police officers. There's nothing right now to keep Josh Hawley from taking the chains off the back door and letting people sneak in like a high school shooter. I mean, that's essentially what we're looking at right now. And so that's why people are legitimately concerned about this. And I'll close with this because I also think it's important. As Frank points out, people were concerned about constitutional rights. No, these people were concerned about getting fired. They don't care about our democracy. If they did, they would have been more serious about this. And I swear I don't hear anybody getting that concerned about constitutional rights when they're knocking black people's heads up against the wall for fighting for rights and justice. Right? Let's be clear about why our law enforcement doesn't get as serious about this as they have for people who were protesting all last summer. There is no chance in heck, if the demographics of that crowd was not composed of a lot of former military and law enforcement people and a lot of non-black people, that this would have happened the way it did. They need to be just as passionate about defending this country against people who look like them as they were against people who are fighting for the soul of this country, who were fighting last summer.
Frank, is that fair?
I've said this before publicly. If you change the religion of the people breaching security on January 6th at the Capitol to Islam and associate them with Al-Qaeda or ISIS, this would not have happened. FBI would have been all over it because their guidelines allow them to do it, and they view the other as the threat. We need to have a domestic terrorism law that lets us treat a threat like a threat, regardless of where it's coming from.
And the only last point I would make to... Oh, go ahead, Carol.
I was going to add one more thing, which
Please.
is I completely agree with Ethan and Frank. I totally do. I know why they're concerned about the race. Just as frightening to me is the fact that months before, the FBI disrupted an almost identical attempt to kidnap a governor with the same online chatter. And those people were white. Those people fell into a domestic extremism world. And just as frightening to me is that they ignored this one when they obviously knew the cookbook, the playbook for disrupting something serious and extremist and homegrown. And so 100% with you on the systemic chronic issues, but fearful, honestly, that something even worse wasn't spotted and taken seriously.
And just to sort of close Jason's political loop, the one modern example of midterm politics defying the terrible history that a president's party loses in the midterms is, you all know, 2002, when the president in office spent every day, and again, the policy choices will be debated till the end of time, right. But that presidency became about understanding who attacked us on 9/11 and making sure they paid a price and could not attack us again. So I think we have to put a pin in that political analysis, Jason Johnson, but as usual, I think you may be onto something.